Hello everyone and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. You may notice a little bit of quality difference. I'm recording from a different device than I usually use, so hopefully that makes a good difference. Welcome your feedback on all of that, and as I welcome your feedback on all things. Today, now, I wasn't really planning to do a video for you, but as anybody in Nova Scotia knows, it's been kind of a gloomy weekend, which certainly altered my plans. I was going to go canoeing and camping this weekend, but that got pushed back a weekend, and so perhaps it's the same with some of you out there. You may be looking for something to do, something to watch, so thought I'd provide a video. But it also meant that I had a chance to do some reading, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about this. It's a report out of British Columbia that I read this morning and a little bit yesterday too. So wanted to go through some of that and some of the stories that have been coming out this week. I think it ties a thread together with the Mass Casualty Commission. And then we have an important week coming up with the schedule that was released with the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings this week. There's 3 days of proceedings, Tuesday through Thursday this week. So I'll talk about that. Plus, of course, the interim report is going to be issued today to governments, tomorrow on the Mass Casualty Commission website. So what caught my eye, one of the things that caught my eye this week was a story from the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities. Well, it was a CBC story about the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, that 5 municipalities are now doing a formal review of their policing through the RCMP. The 5 municipalities are Colchester and Cumberland, which of course is significant in itself. HRM, of course, Halifax has their police, but on the outskirts in the county, the old county area, it's still policed by the RCMP. The town of Wolfville and Escasoni as well are all doing formal reviews. And Amanda McDougall, who's the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, indicates that many of their municipal units are unhappy with police services. I know there was a quote from Murray Scott, former Justice Minister, saying that, you know, we pay for a certain number of officers, but we never seem to have that number or the resources that are supposed to be allocated. And then Ms. McDougall, Mayor McDougall, said that there was an average of an 11% increase in cost for policing in municipalities. Some of that that has been transferred to them for the 2022-23 fiscal year. So that was one thing. The cost of policing is going up and municipalities are unhappy. The second one was a story about the Mass Casualty Commission, and one of the considerations that the police management had was creating a frantic panic were they to release a photo of the RCMP, the replica RCMP vehicle that Wortman was driving. And to me, I mean, I read through the article, and you know, what actually happened was the public that knew about this after the photo was published behaved very responsibly, provided accurate and timely information to the police. There's no evidence that we've seen so far that 911, that the system was backed up as a result of the public, in a frantic panic, as was the concern. What this shows to me is that there's on the police side, perhaps a mistrust of the public, really. Mistrust that the public would behave in a responsible manner, which I think we can be trusted to do during an active shooter situation. And as the evidence bore out, that is what happened. The public behaved responsibly. So interesting article there. Another one that kind of tied back to a comment that Megan Daniel, the lawyer out of Montreal, made at the last week during the proceedings about how for some the RCMP symbol is a symbol of oppression and indeed terror. If you think back to the residential school situation, RCMP officers hauling children out of communities, that sort of thing, it's certainly understandable. So there's some mistrust in both directions. I tie that back even further to the Halifax Street HRM police check report that came out, I think a couple of years ago now. It seems like a couple of years ago now, that talked about some of the mistrust in racialized communities in Halifax and how that relationship with the police needs to improve there too. So perhaps time for a fresh start, a Nova Scotia police force as the legislation allows and seems to anticipate. But, of course, much of Nova Scotia is policed by the RCMP. So it seems like a very big, difficult thing to do to replace a police force, an intimidating prospect. So that's why I was interested to read this report. It was out of BC, and it's a 96-page report, like I say. It's called Transforming Policing and Community Safety in British Columbia. And it was a committee of the legislature, wide-ranging consultations, talking to, hundreds and hundreds of groups, thousands of people that were surveyed, all of the relevant stakeholders. And they came out with, they wanted to talk about police reforms and what that might look like in terms of oversight, transparency, governance, structure, service delivery, standards, funding, and training and education. And their main recommendation was that the police, that BC create a provincial police force. So what you have out there now is similar to what we have in Nova Scotia, where most of the major centers have their own individual, what we would say are municipal police forces, and then the RCMP has most of the rural parts of British Columbia. So very similar to Nova Scotia in that regard. So what this committee recommended was that the British Columbia government create a provincial police force. Some of the main parts of that recommendation were to have community police boards. So we have something like this in Nova Scotia, but they're not particularly influential, particularly over the RCMP, because the RCMP really only answers internally to the RCMP in most regards that way. Equitable access, in other words, that standards, policies, and service expectations be consistent around the province. Tiered responses to non-violent incidents, primarily talking about mental health incidents, where instead of a uniformed police officer showing up at your house or showing up, to whatever the scene is, that somebody with training, a social services provider in plain clothes would respond and not draw undue attention or prevent people from calling in because thinking of criminal consequences flowing from it automatically when a police officer shows up. They were talking about expanding restorative justice. Nova Scotia has a pretty good start on restorative justice as a program, so that could be expanded here as well. More self-administered policing in Indigenous communities. I know that's certainly an important issue here in Nova Scotia, Scotia being one of the municipalities, communities that's reviewing the RCMP. The relationship, one of the things they talk about, and this crosses into every community really, where the police are a little too transient. They're there for a few years and then they're off. They're not living in the communities, that sort of thing. Even more particularly a problem on Indigenous communities, where if they're policed by the RCMP, it's much less likely that the officers are living in the community and part of the community. So that was something they looked at in BC as well, as examining and changing. And training, they want to, as they put it, modernized culturally responsive training to adjust police culture in that regard. So anti-racism training, cultural competency training, and training on trauma-informed practices. And then the last thing they talk about as a main recommendation is having a civilian oversight body. They actually do have a civilian oversight body there, but I think they want to strengthen it. Same here. We have CERT, the Serious Incident Response Team, civilian oversight body, but that certainly could be expanded and improved upon in Nova Scotia. Interestingly, the original director of CERT, the Serious Incident Response Team, is now heading the same organization in British Columbia. That's Ron McDonald from Antigonish, Crown Prosecutor there. So those were things that caught my eye, I guess, in terms of things in the news this week, and if we're trying to wrap our head around potentially replacing the RCMP in Nova Scotia. Yes, it's a big project and potentially intimidating, but it's being done in British Columbia, and so it's an example that we can observe and perhaps follow if it's going well out there. So this week up ahead, today's May 1st, Sunday. Tomorrow, the interim report is going to be released on the Mass Casualty Commission website. I'll certainly take a look at it as soon as it's up and bring you my thoughts on it. They've already said there are not going to be recommendations in this. I think what we'll hear are some preliminary factual determinations, or some, I don't know if they're even determinations, but some preliminary factual narratives being developed, and some reference to the the community trauma that's being felt, and some of the work that's been done in that regard. So I think it'll be a lot of discussion of the procedure that the commission has taken, and less so on the substantive results that have been heard so far, because really we don't have a solid handle on any particular factual element of it just yet. Tuesday is going to be a really interesting day, I think. Tuesday there's going to be a foundational document presentation on the firearms that were possessed by Wortman, and how he obtained them. Best evidence so far, I guess, of how he obtained those firearms. There's also going to be 2 presentations, and I've read these reports. They're posted on the Mass Casualty Commission website. One is by Professor Blake Brown from St. Mary's University in Halifax, also teaches at Dal Law, on the history of gun control in Canada. I'm actually quite interested in this because we, in the Desmond Inquiry, we really learned some important lessons on gun control and where some of the gaps seem to be. There's some disconnects, interprovincially, and people can have a card, and if somebody doesn't check the system to see if they really have a license, there's an issue there, and so we'll see what Professor Brown has to say about all of that. It seems to be just foreshadowing a little bit. I'll be watching to see if he focuses more on the procedures and the gaps in information, conveyed from one police force to another, which seemed to be the biggest issue that we found, versus, looking to ban certain kinds of firearms, which seems to be, the low-hanging political fruit, but a less effective approach. So we'll see what Professor Brown has to say about that. The other one is going to be a remote presentation, I presume, because it's 2 professors from the University of California, Santa Barbara, Tara Lee Tabor and Tristan Bridges, who wrote a paper, seem to have adapted a previous paper of theirs, I presume, just having read it, on mass shootings and masculinity, taking data and anecdotes mostly from the United States, of course, because that's where all the mass shootings take place, most of them, and analyzing that in terms of how it ties into theories of masculinity and those kind of issues. So nothing particularly earth-shattering I wouldn't expect to come out of that presentation, but might be interesting to listen to. We're also going to get a technical witness. This is Benjamin Sampson, who's a firearms scientist out of the government center, I think, in Toronto. So we'll hear what, it's not much detail yet on what that presentation is supposed to, or that witness is supposed to be, what the relevance of that might be. So we'll see what that brings on Tuesday. Wednesday, there's Al McCambridge, who's an RCMP. He's going to talk about uniform procedures for the RCMP. I think we really covered that ground pretty thoroughly last week, so I'm not sure how fascinating that one is going to be. The other one is participant submissions on the access to firearms and the gaps in the evidence that they've identified. That's going to be brought up on Wednesday as well. Thursday is going to be a day of witnesses. First, we're going to have Constables Terry Brown and Dave Melanson, of course, are the 2 officers who mistakenly shot at the Onslow-Belmont Fire Hall, morning of April 19th, 2020. What I'll be watching for in all of their testimony is some explanation of why they stopped so far before the fire hall. I mean, I've been there, I know where the spot is. The only thing that makes sense to me, from knowing everything and having read their statements and talked to some of the other witnesses, is that somebody told them that Wortman was there. There was a police vehicle there, of course. We know that, Dave Gagnon. And it seems that somebody must have told these 2 officers that there was a vehicle there. They stopped well before the fire hall and took shots from a distance and were running as they were doing so, treating the situation very urgently and very assured that was Wortman and not Gagnon. So the question I'll be looking to have answered is who? Who told them? Was it, a civilian that just they're protecting because the person doesn't want to be named? Or was it Wortman himself? And, they really can't say that if that's the case. I mean, there was nothing over the radio communications that we've read that would indicate this, but their private cell phones, and many of the officers were communicating that way, have not been seized or examined from what I have been able to determine. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of answers they have for that. I'm sure they'll be asked about that in cross-examination. There's two other witnesses from another controversial part of the morning of the 19th, which was the death of Heather O'Brien. We talked about her Fitbit data. We had Dr. Matthew Bowes that came in and seemed to have confirmed that she was dead at the time when people thought she was. But we're going to hear from those two officers. The first is Constable Ian Fahey, who was the first to treat Miss O'Brien. She was alive. His testimony, his statement was at the time. And then he turned her care over to Corporal Dwayne Ivany, and he's also going to testify on Thursday. And so we'll get to hear both of their accounts in more detail. They'll be cross-examined, I guess, to some extent on Thursday as well. So could be kind of an intense day of testimony there on Thursday, but very important to hear from these witnesses, and so good to have them up on the stand within a relatively short time of them being identified as such, as potential witnesses. So that's it. That's the week ahead, and just some thoughts on things I've been reading over the gloomy Nova Scotia weather weekend here that we've been having. So that's it. We'll be back to talk about the interim report after it's released, and in anticipation of the proceedings starting up again on Tuesday morning. So thanks you for watching, and we'll see you next time.